Okay. So what they are and why you should care. First, I do have a little bit about Barrel House here. We do a lot of stuff. We started as a magazine and we've kind of grown to do all of these things. You see Susan there at our conference, actually, which we conceived of together. Currently in production for issue 23. We aim for 2 issues a year and we do something like 1.3. We don't stress too much about putting out those 2 issues a year, but that's what we aim for. We run a small press. We put out about 2 books a year. And this is our conference. We're currently getting ready for I think it's something like our 23rd conference. And that's going to be, we do it in Pittsburgh in the fall and in DC in the spring. And this is what Susan and I and Julie Wakeman-Lynn founded together a long time ago. I think 18 years ago, Susan, or something like that. It's crazy.
I think it was 18 years ago. Yep.
Yeah. Well, our kids were very little and crawling around on the floor. So,
that's right.
Yeah.
The house.
Yeah.
So we have to feed the sheep. And
Okay.
I muted her. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
Okay. We also run a writer's retreat called Writer Camp, which we hold here in central Pennsylvania, about 15 minutes from my house. It's a 3 or a 4 day retreat, and it's super laid back. We just kind of hang out and write. That's literally all we do. Somebody else makes the food, so it's pretty great. So again, I'm going to talk about literary magazines, and this is really most relevant for folks who are writing fiction, creative nonfiction, or poetry. Increasingly, there's a really robust market for speculative fiction, science fiction, fantasy. I think increasing relevance for people who are working in graphic areas and comics. Less so for novelists. You know, a lot of, depending on what you're writing and how you're doing it, there may be market for novel excerpts. And least relevance for folks who are writing YA, children's writing, and romance. There's just not as much of a market, or I don't know as much about it. So I think probably most of you fit in those first couple categories. So hopefully this will be relevant for you. Quick history of literary magazines. They've been around for quite some time, and a lot of really good stuff has been published in literary magazines like The Wasteland and Ulysses. More recently, the screenplay for Sorry to Bother You, which is a pretty amazing movie, was published in McSweeney's in full. So long history. This poem, my mother found this poem on Facebook, so that's gives you an idea of the reach that something that's published in a literary magazine could have. This was originally published in Waxwing, and it just went super viral to the extent that, again, my mother is seeing it on Facebook. So lots of things are coming up through the world of literary magazines. When we first started Barrel House, this was my impression of what literary magazines were like. You know, that's George Plimpton, I think, sitting there with a pipe in his big office. Now they're a little more like this. A lot more laid back, a lot more variety. Taco Bell Quarterly is a real thing that folks love. I just submitted something there. You can see it's just the whole thing has really loosened up a lot. There's a lot more room and a lot more space for different things, and for taking all of this not quite as seriously as George Plimpton seemed to be in that previous photo. The way we read has also really changed. A lot of the stuff I read in literary magazines now, I read on my phone, and I read it while I'm, waiting to pick up Chinese food or sitting on a train. It's not always a printed magazine like Barrel House. It's often something that comes to you from social media. Oh, I'm getting ahead of myself. So yeah, the way we find things has changed too. This is the way a lot of people find, including me, find new things to read right now, from following people on Twitter, from things coming through social media feeds. It's just a completely different way to find writing than there was when I started, which was to go down to the bookstore and pick up, the Paris Review or Barrel House or something. these things are coming at us from lots of different angles now. There are a lot of literary magazines. This is actually a count from about 6 months ago. It's probably around about the same because they're constantly new ones coming out and older ones folding. That's happening literally all the time. But there are an awful lot of literary magazines out there. And there are magazines that focus on very specific things. Western short stories, dark science fiction, Black speculative fiction, maps and territories. Actually, they just went out of business recently. But there are a lot of different niche literary magazines out there. So if you're writing something weird and specific, there's a pretty good chance there's a market for that that's out there if you can find it. Also unique formats. I mean, one of my favorites that lots of people know is One Story, which publishes literally one story, I think, every quarter, and they mail it to you in a little package. But also Complete Sentence is all prose that's just one complete sentence. People Holding literally has prompts of people holding things, and then people write stories to that prompt. So there's lots of different kind of formats for literary magazines as well. And lots of theme issues. Again, if you're writing something specific and weird, there's a chance that there's somebody out there that's looking for the thing you're writing. I just submitted to Longleaf Review last week, and I think they're running a special issue, and I think the theme was, it was called like Back in the Day or Looking Back or something like that. So one reason to kind of be involved in this world is to kind of know when things like that are coming down the pike. You might have something that might fit that kind of special format. Also, the way people submit has changed somewhat. Almost nobody takes submissions via paper anymore. Most of it is through Submittable, but there are places like HAD, this is Hobart After Dark, which is a spinoff of the literary magazine Hobart, that only takes submissions in kind of real-time spontaneous submission calls. So they'll say, I did a call for them on, what was it? It was Paranoid. So we just tweeted, I'm reading Paranoid things for HAD for the next hour. Submit and I will turn around. I committed to turn around in 24 hours. So I had, I think 124 submissions came in an hour, and I had either accepted or rejected them all. By that time, the next day, I think I accepted 10 things and rejected the rest. So people are doing interesting things in this space, not just in terms of the writing and how they're getting the writing to people, but also even in how the submissions are coming in. It's constantly changing, which is pretty fun. Work from literary magazines goes into these prestigious books that you're probably familiar with, the Best American, Pushcart. There are a couple others I'm forgetting, but these are publishing stories that are originally published in literary magazines. So why should you care as writers? The first reason is that if you're writing short fiction, essays, poetry, a traditional way that you would build up a collection is to publish in literary magazines, build up a handful of publications, and then look to maybe publish them as a book. This is Amber Sparks, who some of you might know. She's a DC writer. And these are the places where Amber published, I think there are 22 stories in And I Do Not Forgive You. And you can see a lot of them were published in literary magazines initially as she was building up this collection. And this is a collection that really holds together. And Amber was working on a really specific project, publishing them in specific places and building them up into something that then she could send out as a book. Danny Kane, these are poems. Same thing. Danny published these in, you can see lots of different places, including Barrel House, build up into a collection and eventually published in this pretty amazing collection called Flavortown. This is, you can see even J. Robert Lennon. Marissa Landrigan's book is a memoir, but one of the ways that she kind of unlocked how to write the memoir was to think of each chapter as separate essay and then sending them out to literary magazines as she went. And that's how she eventually built up into something that doesn't read like a bunch of different pieces, but reads like a full memoir. But I know, having talked to Marissa, that kind of unlocks something in her head that, oh, I can approach it this way and just think of these as one piece at a time, send them out, build them up, and then start trying to get them published as a book. Another reason you should care about literary magazines, I think you all know who Roxane Gay is. Roxane didn't just start out taking selfies with Michelle Obama and being on the Daily Show. Roxane came up the same way Susan and I came up, which is through literary magazine. She's one of the founders of Pank magazine. Roxane was publishing in a lot of the same places that I was publishing in. It didn't quite work out the same way for me. I don't quite have selfies with Michelle Obama, but we were really working in the same space at the same time. And this is a kind of a close-up from Roxane's old website. Half these places don't exist anymore, which to me is the real kind of mark that you put in the work, and you were engaging in that community as you were kind of coming up and learning how to be a writer. Like this to me, like, Roxane did the work. She didn't just all of a sudden start showing up on the Daily Show. She really did the work, and you can see how much of it she did. She was writing stories for a really long time and sending them out, and was very engaged in this community of literary magazines and the literary community in general. Same for Kristen Arnett. I think probably a lot of you know Kristen. She didn't just show up one day. Same thing. This is her old website, all the places she was publishing as she built up to writing that. I guess it was her second book, was I forget what it's called, the taxidermy book. It's wonderful. But this is how she went from here to there. It's a lot of work in between, and where that work takes place is in literary magazines. Same with Matt Bell. This is Matt's last book, Appleseed. Matt did the same. Matt was publishing, I think we published Matt's second published short story in Barrel House in our second issue. And you can see that he didn't just start out writing a 500-page giant hardback book that was recently nominated for the Ursula Le Guin Award. Matt did the same. He put in the work. This is where kind of he came up through. There's also a lot of opportunity for literary community through literary magazines. These are some pictures of our writer camp and our conference. That's Paul Lisicki doing, like, we call it speed dating with editors at our conference. Literary magazines have readings. This is in the my right-hand side here. That's Chris Gonzalez reading for Split Lip. And you can just see it does offer opportunities to actually connect with people and to kind of form a foothold of a literary community, if that's something you're looking for. And I know DC and Baltimore, there's a lot happening around literary magazines and organizations.
And that was the editor of American Short Fiction. I'm sorry to interrupt you, on the bottom left.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah. That was Nate. Yeah.
That was Nate. Yeah.
Yeah.
Just recognized him there.
That's Nate Brown. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
During a pandemic, all of this went online. So a lot of the same opportunities to make those connections and kind of see people, hear people read, all that went online in the pandemic. And a lot of it has stayed online. I know we're trying to make a point to still do things online because so many more people can participate than they can, at our Pittsburgh conference. So some of the good things that kind of people adapted to in the pandemic, I think, are sticking around. And part of that is literary events online. Social media is another really good opportunity. I think especially some newer magazines and the Flash magazines do a really great job with social media and with promoting their writers. I published something in Split Lip maybe 4 years ago, and every time I publish something somewhere else, they tweet about it and help get the word out about that, which is really cool. So that's another reason, like there's a kind of a rich social media community around certain magazines, especially, which can be really rewarding and kind of to help you out as a writer. It can be a really nice thing. Okay, so that's the part about why you should care. So now a little bit about how things work, and kind of this is the how the sausage gets made part of this. And I'm happy to dive into that a little more if you all want. I'm trying to kind of pop through this so we have some time for questions. So you're going to get rejected. Again, using Roxanne as an example, this is Roxane Gay's blog, 2010. It was called "I've Become Accustomed to Rejection." So I think this is a great example of how everybody, if you're going to be in the space, if you're going to be publishing work, you're going to be getting rejected. That's just part of how the thing is going to work. I always say you could either develop a thick skin about it, or you can just not do it anymore. Those are pretty much your two options. Going to be constantly rejected. Sorry, I'm the person to tell you that. You probably know that already. This is a screenshot of my submittable. You can see declined, 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 and then a little accepted there in the middle of it. So this is what it still looks like today. I have 2 stories I'm actively sending out, and they're getting declined constantly. That's just how it works. You get rejected until you happen to connect with somebody or an outlet that sees the same thing you do, and then you get accepted. But it's still mostly rejection, and the numbers aren't great. So this is from 2020, 2019. You can see here, these are Barrel House. This is from the Barrel House submittable. So kind of behind the submittable wall that you can't see. You can see we were open for 2 days for a flash special issue, and we got 542 submissions. Here, I think we were open for, what is that, 10 days for fiction for the print magazine, and we got 942 submissions. So I think for both of those, for the flash, I think we took 10 pieces because it was an online issue and it was only flash. And for this issue, we probably took 5 or 6 fiction submissions. So 5 or 6 out of 942 is not great. This is Barrel House, and we're probably a 3rd tier literary magazine. So I don't know what these numbers look like for American short fiction or One Story, or God forbid the Paris Review or the New Yorker. But your odds are pretty long, and it's just something you kind of have to get used to if you're going to be working in this world. And I would definitely recommend for writers that this is, I hope I've made a case that this is something you should be interested in and look into, and just making a kind of a realistic case at the same time. Speaking of that, money, not a lot of money. These are calls for submissions. You can see 50, 150, 50. I think the most I ever got paid for a story was $500, which was back in, would have been the early aughts for nerve.com, which doesn't exist anymore. So it would be tough to make a living as a short story writer. You hear about people like Elmore Leonard, who used to write for like Western short story magazines and actually made a living like that for a couple of years before he started writing novels. That would be pretty hard nowadays. If you're writing speculative fiction, this was a little better. Those markets pay better. But you can make money. I wouldn't bank on paying the rent on short fiction or poems or essays any day soon. Speaking of money, one thing you have to think about is whether you're okay paying for submissions. It's pretty typical now to have a $3 submission fee, which a lot of places call a cursory submission fee. Now, if you're going to wind up submitting a story, a poem, or essay 40 times, which is, I think, the most I've ever submitted a story until I got it published. That can run up, and you kind of have to decide what the rules are for you in terms of what you're willing to pay. If some of you are poets, getting poetry manuscripts published is largely falls along through contests. So I know a lot of people who won $500 on a poetry contest, but spent $800 on contest submission fees to get there. Obviously, if you're writing poetry, I assume you're not doing it to make money. If you are, you might want to rethink that idea. But the way the market works doesn't really lend itself to making a lot of money. And figuring out what your own personal rules are for paid submissions is something that I think you either wind up doing over the course of time, or you kind of start out with one and say, I'll pay $3, but I won't pay above $5. For me, I look at, is it a paying market? Is it a supportive market? Do they really support their writers? And do they have a presence kind of in the literary community? If so, I'll probably be willing to pay $3. A lot of places will have kind of a tip jar submission where it's the option, you have the option. I tend to do that when I see it because I have a full-time job. So I feel like I can afford to spend $3 to help support a magazine that I'm interested in publishing in. But again, you kind of have to figure out what your own parameters are for that. I know people who have a budget and they'll say, I'll spend $100 submitting because I have a bunch of things I'm actively submitting right now, but I'm not going to go over that. So it's something that you kind of have to figure out. And I'm happy to answer questions about that or talk more about it also once I'm through. So finding markets, this is something that a lot of people ask me about when I run online workshops. There are places where you can go to find open calls for submission, or places that or do kind of searches on places to submit. Heavy Feather Review took this over from Entropy. Oh, I still have the wrong URL in here. Entropy just folded, or they gracefully went out of business, and Heavy Feather Review took over something that they used to do, which was where to submit. Really useful if you're looking to submit something specific, especially. You can find calls for books, novellas, stories, poems, essays, and they update it regularly, which is a real service they provide. New Pages has a database and a list of literary magazines. Duotrope has the same thing. That's a paid service. Submittable has a discover feature where they will kind of float opportunities up to you based on some algorithm that's bubbling behind the surface. I need to move my my little bar here. Oh yeah, the other thing that I do a lot is follow literary magazines and editors and other writers on Twitter. That's a great way to find out when different places are opening for submissions and what they're opening for. That's actually been super useful for me personally. There are prestigious markets, and there are people that publish lists of the magazines that show up in these prestigious markets more so than others. Oh, I think I just went, sorry, I thought I had another screen there. So yeah, if you Google literary rankings pushcart prize, there's somebody out there that's maintaining a website that's looking at all the magazines that are published in pushcart, how often and how many stories they have there, and they're ranking them based on how often they show up in pushcart. There's a couple other people that do this, so you can find them via Google. If you're looking for strictly prestigious markets, that's the thing to do. I wouldn't necessarily recommend that kind of writers who are just starting out with this approach it that way, but I know some folks do, and that's cool. Again, I find Twitter to be a really useful way to find out who is opening and for what. That's kind of a way that these things could come to you rather than you going out and looking for them in particular. Oh, this is one of those rankings. So again, there are people and places who maintain lists like this that'll say, use best American as the metric of how many, which outlets publish the most in best American. So a good way to look and see kind of gives you a level of kind of a prestige ranking, if that's something that you're interested in. I think this is the best way to find out where to publish, and this is what I've done my entire life, basically. Figure out somebody who's writing stuff that's similar to mine, but better, and is a little ahead of me in terms of their publishing experience. Look at where they're publishing, and that tells me, oh, they might be interested in the stuff I'm writing. So for me, when I first started out, Amy Bender, Stacy Richter, Mike Cisnewski, they were people who were writing kind of like the stuff I was writing, or I was kind of aspiring to write stories like they were writing. The places that they were publishing them in were places that I knew might be open to the kind of thing I was trying to do, at least. So a really good way to cut through the clutter and also try to do a little bit of matchmaking for yourself and say, oh, I'm writing poems kind of like Danny Kaine. I'm using a lot of pop culture and I'm trying to be funny. I should look at the places where Danny published those poems, because those places might naturally be open to the kind of stuff I'm doing.
Can I toss something out, Dave?
Absolutely.
I was just going to say, like, you gave that very helpful, a few helpful screenshots earlier of where people thank or acknowledge where their stories were first published when they have a book out. That's a great place to look. If there's a writer that you admire, look in their acknowledgement section and see where they published some of the stories originally. If you feel that you write the way that they write, those markets are obviously like that kind of writing or that style. So
absolutely. Actually, I think that's my next screen. Yeah.
I'm sorry.
So, I know, it's perfect transition. So here's Amber. Amber is a person I would consider, actually, I just did this recently. It's like, oh, this is kind of like an Amber story. I wonder where, let me look at where she's been publishing recently, because maybe they would be interested in this. And you can do this online now too, in addition to looking through a book, which is what I would do. I'd also recommend, like, this is Mary Gaitskill's first book. Someone like who's pretty famous, like you could look at George Saunders' first and second books and get a good sense for where you might want to publish your weird kind of satirical short fiction. If you look at his third through his whatever number book we're on, they're all going to be published in the New Yorker. So that's less useful for folks like us who are still kind of out there trying to find the right fit for our work. Okay. So this is the kind of what do you do in certain situations that are going to come up if you start submitting your work to literary magazines. People are always really stressed about cover letters. Don't be. Especially now with almost everybody reading through Submittable, it's really easy to not even look at them until after you've read a story, poem, essay. In fact, that's how I do it. I don't look at them at all when I'm reading submissions. If the work seems especially kind of bonkers, I might look at it to see like, what's this person's deal? But generally, I don't even read them. The best case scenario is you may have published in a bunch of places that are like the place that I'm reading for. And then I might think, oh, this person published in Hobart and I don't know, this place and this place. Those places are a lot like Barrel House. Maybe they're going to be kind of in our lane. That's the best case scenario. Most of the people I know honestly don't really look at them, so it's not something to worry about too much. I do have mine broke down here. And it's pretty straightforward. I do have a version of this that I could share if you all are interested in, that just talks about It's just the same presentation, just with this last part. It's only this last part. So if you're interested, I'm happy to share this. But it's pretty straightforward. And like I said, my advice is just don't make it seem like if I got stuck in an elevator with you, it would just be a terrible experience. There are people who go on and on and on, and they've published 200 pieces and they list out every single piece. There are people who list out every single job they've had because they think it's cute to list out every single job they've had. And it's just not super cute. It's really best to just be pretty businesslike in this. If I think that I'm submitting to a market that is kind of like some places I've published before, I will list that out. So here I have my example. This was submitting to a redivider. I felt like they're kind of like Booth, Hobart, Mid-American Review, and Quarterly West. They're kind of in the same space. So I thought, let me at least, the best case here is that a person reads this and they have some kind of indication that my work might be a good fit. They're still going to read the work and accept it or reject it based on the work and not on this letter, which a lot of places aren't even going to read. So the other thing, if you don't have any publications, just say, this would be my first publication. That's awesome. Like I said, we published Matt Bell's second story. It would have been super cool if it was his first story. So the right kind of editor is going to look at that. And if your work is great, they're going to be really excited about the idea of publishing this person's first story. It's really cool when you get a chance to do that. Especially if you think this person is so good, like they might really be headed to something. So don't be ashamed of that or feel like you have to, it's a strike against you. I really think the right kind of outlet and editor is going to think that's a great thing. And they might be really psyched to publish your first piece, no matter what it is. So here's a bunch of what should you do if things. Most of these are things that people have asked me about or I've seen them kind of get wrong. So if the piece is rejected, don't do anything. Don't email them back and tell them they suck and you didn't want to get published in their lousy magazine anyway. That happens 2 to 4 times a year. And it's stupid. So just go about your business. Like I said, everybody's getting rejected all the time. Don't get hung up on it. Do not respond unless you say, hey, thanks so much. Really appreciate you taking a look. No upside at all in clapping back at somebody, at strangers that you've asked to evaluate your work. They've evaluated it. That the interaction is over with. If you don't hear back and they've got a posted time that says it's their usual response time, it's totally cool to get in touch and say, hey, I'm inquiring about this submission on this date. Your guidelines indicate that I maybe should have heard back right now. Just checking in. And keep in mind that the longer a play, if they're going to accept a story, that can take a long time because it might have to work through several people to get to that point of acceptance. So if the story's out for a fairly long time, it can mean that it's working through that process and it can be a good thing. But it's also not a bad move or a weird move to reach back out and just make that inquiry. That's completely fine. The good rejection is real. A lot of places have tiered rejections where there's kind of a just the facts, rejection, and then a good rejection will say, we really like this, but we're not accepting it for whatever reason. That reason could be we have too many stories by dudes. We have too many stories by women. We have too many stories, or we just published something that's kind of like this. There could be lots of reasons why a particular story might get rejected. But if you get the good rejection, which usually asks to send more work, send more work. I've also heard from a lot of women that they wait for a polite amount of time before sending something back, with polite maybe being 6 months or a year. If you get that good rejection and the ask to send more work, send more work. You don't have to wait for a polite amount of time. If you have something that you think might be a fit, just send it back. Men don't wait. They send something back the same day because we're obnoxious and overconfident. So that would be my recommendation. If you get that, send more work. If the piece is accepted elsewhere, that's awesome. Withdraw it right away from any places that have it. If you're, a lot of places, most of the submissions I send nowadays work through Submittal, but I also do maintain my own list of where I'm sending things because some of them will work through email. And I don't want to forget if a piece gets accepted. I want to make sure I reach out right away and withdraw it from anywhere, because if you waste somebody's time, most of the folks who are reading submissions are volunteers, they're not getting paid. If you waste their time, maybe they spend some time fighting for your story and arguing with other people and convincing folks to accept it, and then when they reach out with that acceptance, you say, oh, you know what, that got accepted somewhere else 3 months ago. You just wasted a lot of that person's time and that outlet. It's a real bummer when that happens. And it's not a great way to ingratiate yourself with that editor or that outlet. So again, just reach out and withdraw it as soon as something gets accepted elsewhere. If something is accepted, that's awesome. Now you're in a short business relationship with an editor and an outlet, and your job is to be normal and hit deadlines. And keep in mind, they're having the same relationship with 20 other writers at the same time. So there's no upside in being difficult or standing out. You just want to be businesslike and work with them, give them what they need when they need it, react in a businesslike fashion. It's something to think about. And having done this as long as I have, there are times when you wind up having a pretty bad interaction with somebody who wrote something that's really awesome. And the result of that is usually just like, you know what, never again. I really don't want to work with that person again. We've published books by people who came to us with an essay and we're like, Megan's awesome. Let's see what she's doing. We're not going to do that with somebody who was difficult in just this very brief interaction that we had with them. So again, there's no upside in kind of making yourself difficult or not being a good partner in this brief timeline where you're going to have to work on this project with an editor and maybe a managing editor and an artist or whatever. Just try to be cool and normal is my advice.